Hey guys, tonight we slip off our modern shoes and pad barefoot into a world that smells like river mud, warm clay and lamp smoke, and we do it with the softest, safest flashlight we can manage. You are standing at the edge of ancient Mesopotamia, where the sun comes up like a slow coin lifting out of the haze, and every important idea seems to begin as a mark pressed into wet earth. Our topic is Yahweh, from Anunnaki to the God of the Bible, and you already know this is the kind of night where some parts are widely accepted, history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination, because the evidence might be strong in one corner and thin in another. Most historians agree that religions grow over time, and historians debate the how and the why. So we are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. Also, fair warning, you probably won't survive this if your attention span is trained entirely on 15-second videos and instant noodles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I like knowing where in the world you're listening from while you pretend you're just resting your eyes. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a city that feels both simple and impossibly busy, the kind of place where the streets are dust and the schedules are carved in grain. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian cities like Uruk and Ur became major centers of temple life, administration and trade. And archaeology suggests that writing appears here in the late 4th millennium BCE as a practical tool first, not as poetry. The evidence we do have points to lists, rations and accounting, which is honestly comforting in a strange way. Humanity invents writing and immediately uses it to track who owes how much barley. Even in the ancient world, somebody is basically running a spreadsheet just with reeds and mud. You walk past a courtyard where clay sits in shallow trays, still damp from the river. A scribe, or maybe a scribe in training, presses a stylus into a tablet with quick little angles. Wedge by wedge the marks appear. Cuneiform looks like tiny bird tracks marching in straight lines, and you can almost hear the soft tap 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 as the reed bites the clay. What's broadly accepted is that these marks become a bridge between everyday life and the divine, because temples are not only places to pray. They are warehouses, workshops, offices and identity machines. They store grain, manage labour and organise festivals. They also give people a language for what they fear, what they hope and what they cannot control. And here is where the night begins to do that gentle, careful split we promised. On solid ground, most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is deeply woven into city life, with many gods associated with places, powers and responsibilities. Archaeology suggests that the temple is often the beating heart of the city, and the gods are not distant abstractions. They are patrons, they are bosses. They are, in the most literal sense, part of how the city runs. If you want to be fed, you might be on a temple ration list. If you want to be protected, you bring offerings. If you want your life to make sense, you tell stories about the sky, the river, the storm, and the very stubborn problem of drought. Now let's step onto the mist for a moment, but keep the solid ground visible behind us. One interpretation is that when later cultures and later texts talk about the divine, they sometimes echo older patterns of naming and authority, even if the meanings shift. Names can travel, titles can be borrowed. A careful reading might suggest that some divine language works like a hand-me-down cloak, new shoulders, or same stitching, different weather. This is suggestive, not conclusive. And if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You pause near the edge of a kiln, and the air is warm like bread about to become toast. The clay smell is sweet and mineral, and the smoke is soft enough to make your eyes half close. In that half closing, you can imagine a whispered name forming not as a final answer, but as a possibility. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a secret pipeline, not a hidden master plan, but the slow human habit of shaping the unseen into words you can carry? As you drift through the city, you notice how many names there are. Some are clearly gods, some are kings, some are officials, some are simple workers receiving their daily ration, and the line between holy and ordinary feels thinner than you expect. That's not a dramatic claim, it's just the texture of the evidence. The earliest writing we have is often administrative, and yet it sits right beside temple life. The sacred and the practical share the same shelves. Here's a quirky little anchor that reminds you these people are not mythic statues, they are tired humans. Archaeology suggests scribal schools existed, and some survive in tablets read like exercises or practice texts, the ancient equivalent of writing "I will not talk in class" 100 times. It's oddly adorable. You picture a student rubbing a sore wrist thinking, "I invented civilization and all I got was homework." If that is not timeless, nothing is. And yet, because your brain is modern, a popular rumour claims that some ancient texts hint at beings from the sky visitors, teachers, watchers, the kind of idea that makes late-night documentaries whisper louder than they should. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's not widely accepted as history. What's broadly accepted is that these are mythic frameworks, stories that explain power and order in a world where storms and harvests decide whether you eat. A fringe idea proposes that the myths preserve literal memories of non-human visitors. But the evidence is thin, and a more cautious explanation could be that humans are simply very good at turning the unknown into characters. Historians still argue whether some early divine names and titles reflect distinct gods, local versions of a god, or evolving understandings over time, especially when later scribes copy and recopy traditions. You can feel how easy it would be for meanings to slide. A name in one city might be a title in another. A protector in one era might become a judge in the next. And when texts survive only in pieces, the gaps invite interpretation like empty seats at a theatre. You keep walking, and your sandals, if you have them, pick up fine dust. A donkey brays somewhere with the offended confidence of an animal that knows it is essential to the economy. You hear water being poured, the clink of a jar, the murmur of bargaining. Most historians agree that this world is not one of pure superstition, but of complex administration craft and trade, and the gods are part of that complexity. The evidence we do have points to a society where divine order and human order mirror each other. The king serves the god, the city serves the temple serves the people, sometimes kindly, sometimes like an accountant who never smiles. And this is where the outline promise for tonight settles into your hands. We are beginning with clay with names, with the earliest recorded attempts to make the invisible legible. We are keeping the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. One interpretation is that later ideas about a singular personal covenant-making God might emerge in conversation with older ways of thinking about divine authority, divine presence, and divine names, not as a copy, not as a simple rewrite, but as a long human process of choosing, rejecting, refining, and reimagining. You stand near the kiln again, letting that warm air brush your face, and you watch a tablet dry its marks, becoming permanent. In your modern life, you can delete a sentence in a second. Here, every line is a commitment. It's almost poetic that the earliest trail of gods is literally pressed into earth, and as you breathe in the clay and smoke, you let one thought settle like silt in a riverbed. What if a name becomes more than a name? Not because it arrived from the stars, but because generation after generation keeps leaning toward it, shaping it, arguing over it, praying into it, and carrying it forward, one quiet mark at a time. The kiln warmth still clings to your cheeks as you drift away from the courtyard, and the smell of clay follows you like a quiet, dusty scarf. The stylus taps in your memory that soft little percussion of wedges becoming words, and you start to notice something calming about it. When people are unsure, they write. When they are sure, they also write. Humans are very consistent that way. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamia, the gods are not just belief, they are a whole operating system for the universe, and archaeology suggests we're seeing layers of myth and ritual preserved in texts copied and recopied across centuries. The evidence we do have points to stories that explain why the world is ordered, why it is unfair, why kings rule, why storms hit, why floods swallow fields, and why your neighbour's goats always seem to thrive, while yours look like they're auditioning for a tragedy. Now you step closer to the mist again, but not so far that you can't see the solid ground, because here comes the word that has launched 1,000 late-night videos and at least 3 people in the comments yelling at each other in all caps. The Anunnaki. On the documented side, what's broadly accepted is that Anunnaki appears in ancient Mesopotamian tradition as a group term for gods with meanings and roles that shift by text and era. In some contexts, they are associated with the high divine assembly, and in others, they show up as underworld powers or judges. A careful reading might suggest that this isn't a single fixed species of being, but a flexible label used by scribes and storytellers to talk about divine authority as a group, kind of like, say, in the court, the council or the board, except the board controls weather and sometimes your fate, so you probably bring snacks and respect. You imagine a storyteller in a courtyard, at night oil lamp, flickering eyes reflecting firelight. The stories aren't delivered like a textbook. They are performed. They move. The gods gather, the heavens argue. The earth groans, people in the crowd nod because it feels true, even if it is not meant as a literal report. Most historians agree that ancient myths are often doing many jobs at once, explaining the world, reinforcing social order, honouring a city's patron deity, and giving people language for the vast forces that don't care about their feelings, which is honestly a mood. Archaeology suggests that many of these texts come down to us through copies made in scribal traditions, and the copying itself shapes what survives. That matters, not because it proves anything secret, but because it reminds you that a text is not a single moment frozen in time. It's a river of versions, it's a trail of hands. It's 1,000 tired students learning to wedge the same signs into clay until their wrists feel like they've been personally cursed by the god of repetitive strain injury. One interpretation is that sky language in ancient myths can feel especially magnetic to modern readers. We hear heavens and our minds immediately reach for rockets, aliens, and the kind of glowing doorway you only see in movies when the budget is generous. But a more cautious explanation could be that the sky is where storms live, where stars wheel, where the sun comes from, and where the human imagination naturally projects power. That's not boring, it's actually kind of beautiful. It's possible that what feels like science fiction to us is simply ancient poetry for the uncontrollable. And yet, because you live in the modern world where every mystery gets a thumbnail, a fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial visitors, and that ancient myths are coded records of contact. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists partly because it scratches a very human itch, the desire for a single dramatic explanation that ties everything into a neat ribbon. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why it's tempting. It turns messy history into one bold reveal. But the evidence is thin, and will say so. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You keep walking, and the city's sounds soften into a steady hush, footsteps, distant murmurs, the occasional splash of water, and somewhere a baby practicing the ancient art of refusing to sleep. Some things survive every millennium. You pass a wall where someone has pressed a seal into clay, leaving an image that feels like a tiny poster for a story, animal symbols, maybe a god or a king. It's small, but it carries a big idea. Order can be stamped. Identity can be marked. Reality can be narrated. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki functioned primarily as a specific group of deities tied to certain myths, or as a broader category name that scribes applied differently over time and place, especially as languages and empires shifted. And you can feel the reason for the argument right there in the clay. The same word can breathe differently in different centuries. Now you let your mind hover over a few of the famous mythic shapes that float through this region's storytelling without pretending they all mean the same thing. There are creation stories that frame the cosmos as an ordered space, where divine decisions shape the structure of reality. There are flood stories that speak to the terrifying truth that rivers can give life and also erase it overnight. There are tales of kings seeking immortality and finding instead the blunt lesson that humans are not built to last forever. Most historians agree these narratives are not news reports, but they can preserve real anxieties, real landscapes, and real cultural memory. One interpretation is that when later traditions develop ideas about a singular God who speaks, commands, judges, and covenants, they may be doing so in dialogue with an older Near Eastern world full of councils, assemblies, decrees, and divine courtrooms, not copying it in a simple way, but responding to it, arguing with it, reworking it, rejecting parts while keeping the language of authority. This raises the possibility that the ancient divine group imagery becomes a kind of scaffolding that later writers climb, even if they eventually remove the scaffolding and insist the building stands on one foundation alone. And now the cinematic what if mood note drifts in like smoke, soft and not demanding your belief. What if those old council scenes are a shadow play on the wall of a lamp-lit room, and each generation shifts the puppets a little? What if the shapes stay familiar, but the meaning changes until one day the storyteller stops saying they and starts saying? He and the room goes quiet in a different way. You stop at the edge of the courtyard and look up. The sky is huge, indifferent, and full of stars that don't care about your personal growth journey. You think about how natural it is for humans to place power up there. The heavens become a stage because it is the one place you cannot touch. You can build a wall. You can dig a canal. You can argue with your cousin about boundary stones. But you cannot negotiate with lightning, so you narrate it. You personify it. You give it a name you can say out loud. Here's another quirky little detail that keeps you grounded. Many of these myths don't treat gods like perfect distant abstractions. They can be moody, they can bicker, they can change their minds, they can act like an entire workplace chat thread when the deadline hits and nobody read the memo. That doesn't make them fake. It makes them human-shaped stories about forces that feel personal because they affect your life. And still you keep that truth ladder in your pocket like a smooth stone. Documented, the Anunnaki appear in ancient texts as divine figures in a mythic framework. Interpreted, the language of councils and heavens can influence later religious imagination. Imagined, what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a secret invasion, but the slow transformation of how people picture ultimate authority. You take one last breath of kiln-warmed air as the night leans closer, and you let the lamp smoke curl into your thoughts. The clay is drying, the words are hardening, and you can feel the tension building not toward a single hidden truth, but toward a long, complicated human journey where names, stories, and power keep changing hands. The stars above the city feel steady, but your feet don't stay in one place for long. You drift past the last thick walls, past the canal smell, and the soft labour of water being lifted, and the air changes. The kiln warmth fades, the clay scent thins. Even the stylus tapping in your memory becomes quieter, like it's being wrapped in cloth. You trade city noise for a wider hush, the kind that belongs to open land, scrubby hills and long roads that don't care what year it is. Most historians agree that the ancient Levant is a crossroads, and archaeology suggests that people in this region move mix and adapt over centuries, especially between coastal plains, hill country deserts, and river valleys. The evidence we do have points to a patchwork of communities rather than one neat labelled group marching in single file like a school field trip. You have farmers rooted in their fields, traders threading routes between towns, herders shifting with seasons, and families who do a little bit of everything because survival rarely respects job titles. You start to feel the difference between city religion and road religion. In the city, the gods have addresses, temples have schedules, priests have keys. Out here in the hills and highlands, devotion can be more portable, more intimate, and sometimes more improvised. You can't exactly drag a full temple complex behind a donkey, unless your donkey is secretly a superhero and has been hiding it for attention. So the sacred becomes lighter. A name, a vow, a small ritual, a shared story repeated by the fire until it feels like part of your bones. What's broadly accepted is that identities in the ancient Levant form through language kinship, local customs, and the simple daily act of deciding who is us and who is them. That boundary can be gentle like dialect and cooking styles, or sharp like politics and conflict. One interpretation is that the distinctiveness of a community's deity can grow alongside these boundaries, not as a magic trick, but as a social process. You can almost watch it happen. The more a group defines itself, the more it might define its god too, emphasizing certain traits, certain stories, certain promises. And this is where the smooth stone in your pocket becomes useful. You rub it with your thumb, letting it remind you some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You climb into the hill country in your mind's eye, where the air is cooler and the nights are darker and the land feels closer to your skin. The grass is stubborn, the trees are sparse in places and generous in others. You hear insects, you hear your own breathing, you hear that little internal voice that says, "Wow, this is peaceful," and then immediately asks, "Where is the nearest snack?" Ancient life is gorgeous, yes, but it also has a very consistent theme. You are always one missed meal away from becoming extremely interested in barley. Archaeology suggests that settlement patterns shift over time, with periods where highland villages expand and reorganize. The evidence we do have points to changes in how people live, what they eat, how they build, and how they relate to nearby powers. Most historians agree that the late Bronze Age collapse and the transition into the Iron Age bring major disruptions across the Eastern Mediterranean world. That doesn't mean every village knows the phrase systems collapse, but it does mean trade networks break big political structures, wobble, and smaller communities may find space to grow or redefine themselves. History, as usual, is a mix of pressure and opportunity, like your brain trying to work while you're also trying to fall asleep. Now gently into the debated zone. Historians still argue whether the emergence of early Israel as a distinct identity is best explained mainly through internal development within Canaan, through movements of people, through a blend of both, or through different processes happening in different places at different times. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. The ancient world doesn't hand you a clean timeline with colour-coded labels. It hands you pottery shards, settlement maps, and texts written later that remember earlier times through story. Here's the mainstream safe anchor. You keep returning to what's broadly accepted is that ancient Israelite religion does not appear fully formed in a single moment. It develops across generations, influenced by its surroundings and by its own internal debates. Archaeology suggests continuity with Canaanite material culture in many highland communities, which means the people, their tools and their daily lives often look more similar to their neighbours than later identity stories might imply. That doesn't reduce the importance of later traditions. It simply reminds you that identity usually begins as a gradual drift, not a dramatic costume change. One interpretation is that a god's profile can sharpen when a community experiences uncertainty, when empires loom, when borders shift, when survival feels fragile. The need for a protective, guiding divine presence can intensify. That interpretation is cautious, not conclusive, but it's a human pattern you can recognize even now. When life gets messy, you reach for what feels solid. Some people reach for family, some reach for routines, some reach for a deity who seems to say, "You belong. You are seen. Keep walking." And here comes the quirky tidbit with a gentle warning label attached. A popular rumour claims that certain ancient groups carried secret names of a high god across deserts, preserving a hidden tradition untouched by the cities. It's a romantic idea and it makes for a great campfire story, but it's hard to verify. The evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that names and titles move through ordinary contact into marriage, trade, seasonal gatherings, shared languages, and the very normal habit of borrowing what sounds powerful. Humans borrow words the way we borrow cooking tricks. Somebody tries a new spice and suddenly the whole family thinks they invented it. You keep walking through imagined twilight and the mood shifts from administrative to personal. You picture a family camped on a ridge. The fire is small because wood is precious. The smoke curls low. The stars look close enough to pluck, and you feel the old temptation to read meanings into them. This is where the cinematic what-if note arrives soft and not demanding. What if a vow spoken here in the quiet between wind gusts becomes the seed of covenant language? Later on, not a magical instant transformation, but the beginning of a habit speaking promises into the darkness, as if the darkness can hear you. You roll the stone in your palm again, and you think about how communities carry memory. Some memories are written, others are sung, others are repeated in family lines like heirlooms you can't pawn. Most historians agree that oral tradition plays a major role in preserving and shaping identity in many ancient societies. Archaeology can't record a lullaby, but it can suggest the context where stories travel, shared meals, seasonal feasts, long nights, when the only entertainment is the storyteller who's either very good or very stubborn. If you've ever listened to someone's vacation slideshow, you understand both possibilities. Now, carefully, to keep our truth ladder honest, it's possible that the earliest forms of devotion in these communities involve multiple divine figures, household practices, and local shrines rather than a single unified system. That's not a scandal. It's normal. Religion in lived reality is often messier than religion in later ideals. Scholars continue to debate how quickly and how widely exclusive worship took hold and in what forms. And that debate matters because it reminds you later texts can describe earlier times through a lens of what the community eventually became, not necessarily what it was in every detail. So you hold two images at once without forcing them to fight. On solid ground, you have a region of moving peoples, shifting settlements and developing identities. On the misty side, you have the possibility that a particular divine name becomes a marker, a boundary, a banner, or even a whispered comfort. One interpretation is that this sharpening happens not only through theology, but through daily life, the way you name your children, the way you swear an oath, the way you tell a story about where you came from. And the what if lingers like smoke in your hair. What if the earliest covenant voice isn't first a thunderclap in a temple, but a steady murmur at a campfire, a promise repeated until it feels real? What if the sacred begins as something you carry, not something you visit? You take another step into the hills, and you can feel the road pulling you forward, away from the city's clay tablets, and toward the landscapes where names don't just sit on shelves. They travel on tongues. They ride in breath. They cling to memory like dust on your sandals. The hill air is cooler now, and it has that clean, dry bite that makes your lungs feel like they're being politely rinsed. The campfire smoke from your imagined ridge clings to your clothes, and the little smooth stone in your pocket is warm from your palm. You keep walking through the Levantine landscape where every horizon looks like it has been sanded down by wind and time, and you start to sense how religion here isn't only about what people believe, it's also about where they belong. Most historians agree that the ancient Canaanite world included many city-states and local cults, and archaeology suggests a vibrant religious landscape with temples, figurines, inscriptions, and a web of myths that share family resemblance across the region. What's broadly accepted is that this is not a blank stage awaiting a new religion. It's already crowded with gods, titles and stories. And if you listen closely, you can hear the hum of competing claims: who protects us, who feeds us, who grants victory, who owns the rain. On solid ground, you meet names that matter. El often described in older Canaanite tradition as a high god figure, and Baal commonly associated with storms and fertility in many myths. There are others too, a whole caste, a divine neighbourhood, with relationships, rivalries and job descriptions. Archaeology suggests that this kind of pantheon structure is common in the region, and the evidence we do have points to a shared cultural vocabulary for speaking about the divine council scenes, titles like Most High imagery of thrones, mountains, seas and battles with chaos. Now keep the truth ladder handy, because we are about to stand on a place where solid ground and mist meet like shoreline. One interpretation is that later Israelite tradition grows in conversation with this Canaanite world, adopting some language, rejecting some practices, and reshaping familiar images toward a distinct theological centre. This is suggestive, not conclusive in every detail, but it's a reasonable way to read how cultures develop. They don't grow in isolation. They grow in dialogue, sometimes friendly, sometimes argumentative, sometimes like two neighbours arguing over whose rooster is allowed to be loud at dawn. You pause and look at the hills, imagining small villages tucked into folds of land. In the day, the sun is bright enough to bleach colours. At night, the stars feel heavy. You can see how a storm god becomes emotionally important in a place where rain decides everything. You can also see how a high god figure becomes socially important in a place where authority needs a cosmic mirror. The gods reflect the pressures of life. They become a language for power, food safety, and meaning. Historians still argue whether the earliest Israelite worship was fundamentally distinct from Canaanite worship from the beginning, or whether it started as a variation within the broader Canaanite religious world and then sharpened into distinctiveness over time. There's no full consensus, and you can understand why. Material culture can look similar even when ideas are shifting. Practices can overlap even when identity stories later draw thick lines. And texts written later can emphasize separation because separation becomes important to the community telling the story. You pass a roadside shrine in your imagination, a simple stone structure, maybe a standing stone, maybe an altar. Nothing flashy, nothing with a gift shop. It's the kind of sacred space that would barely register to an empire, but it matters intensely to the people who walk here. Archaeology suggests that small-scale cultic sites existed across the region in different periods, and what's broadly accepted is that religious life often happens at multiple levels, household, local, and centralized. That matters later when we talk about exclusivity, because the real world rarely flips a single switch. Now for the quirky tidbit offered gently, like a warm blanket, not like a headline. In some ancient Near Eastern texts, and imagery gods are portrayed as part of a divine council, a heavenly assembly where decisions are made. This is not a fringe claim, it's a well-known motif in the region. But here's the odd part that keeps your mind awake in a pleasant way. Councils are such a human idea. Even the cosmos apparently needs meetings. You can almost picture the agenda: Item 1 thunder, Item 2 famine, Item 3 someone please stop the humans from building towers. And you know there's always that one deity who talks too long, and everyone else is staring at the wall thinking about snacks. One interpretation is that when later biblical texts speak of Yahweh in ways that echo council imagery, they may be engaging with a familiar motif but reframing it. Instead of a god among gods, you increasingly see a god above all, a supreme authority whose uniqueness is emphasized. This raises the possibility that older imagery is not erased but reorganized. The old stage remains, but the spotlight moves. Now the misty cinematic what if drifts in soft as smoke. What if a familiar title like El God in the generic sense, and also the name of a high deity in older tradition, becomes a bridge. What if people begin to say in their own devotional language, "Our God is the Most High," and the phrase feels both familiar and newly specific? What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a secret replacement, but the slow narrowing of focus, like a lens being turned until one face fills the frame. Here's where we must stay careful. A popular rumour claims that ancient Israel simply stole Canaanite religion and renamed it like slapping a new label on an old jar. That's an oversimplification, and it's not a fair summary of how historians usually describe the evidence. A more cautious explanation could be that cultures share, borrow and transform religious language and practice in complex ways. Sometimes they adopt, sometimes they adapt, sometimes they reject, sometimes they invert. Often they do all of these at once, depending on region and period. The evidence we do have points to both continuity and change, and the balance between them is exactly the sort of thing scholars continue to debate. You keep walking, and you notice how names behave in a crowded divine world. Names can be personal, names can be titles, names can be banners. In many ancient contexts, a name is not just a label, it's a claim. To say a god's name is to invoke power, loyalty, identity. And if a community begins to emphasize one name more than others, that name can become a boundary marker. It's possible that devotion becomes a way of saying this is who we are, in a landscape where everyone is trying to define themselves. Historians still argue whether the push toward exclusive worship of Yahweh is best understood mainly as an internal theological evolution, as a reaction against neighbouring cults like Baal worship, as a political strategy tied to centralization, or as some combination of all three. You can feel the truth of that uncertainty. Human motives rarely come in single flavours. They come mixed like a stew where you can taste onion, but you can't always identify who put it in. Now, without naming future sections, you let a small motif return for cohesion: the smell of smoke, the campfire smoke, the lamp smoke, the kiln smoke. Smoke is what connects earth to sky. It's what turns a physical offering into something that feels like it travels, and it's what makes every sacred space, from a household shrine to a grand temple, feel similar at the level of the senses. Your eyes sting a little, your throat tightens, you blink slowly. It's almost like the body understands devotion before the mind explains it. One interpretation is that the shift toward a singular God in the biblical tradition is not simply a philosophical decision, but a lived process of narrowing loyalties, refining language, and recasting old images into new claims, imagined softly. What if a young listener at a village fire hears a story about the Most High, about the storm, about the sea, and then hears an elder whisper, "No, not them, not many, just him," and that whisper lands with a strange calm? You don't have to believe the whisper is historically recorded to feel how it could happen. That's the point of gentle imagination. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues, and the clues in this section are about a crowded landscape, where one name begins to matter more, and where the old divine family tree is slowly pruned, branch by branch, into something more singular. The road keeps its patient rhythm under your feet, and the hills roll like quiet waves that never quite reach the sea. Smoke is still your travelling companion, sometimes from a village fire, sometimes from a lamp in a doorway, and sometimes just from your own imagination refusing to let go of the kiln back in Mesopotamia. You rub the smooth stone in your pocket again, and it's cool now, the way a river stone always returns to calm, no matter how warm your hand gets. Most historians agree that early Israelite religion develops over time, rather than appearing instantly as a finished system, and archaeology suggests a complicated blend of continuity and change in the ancient Levant. The evidence we do have points to a world where people are not living inside neat labels. They are living inside seasons, taxes, births, deaths, droughts, weddings, and the constant question of whether the grain will hold out. Religious language grows in that soil. Now you come to a place where names begin to feel like footprints in soft dirt. Not all of them are deep, and some are partial, but you can see the direction. On the documented side, what's broadly accepted is that the name Yahweh appears in the biblical tradition as the personal name of Israel's God, and that there are scholarly discussions about how and when devotion to Yahweh becomes dominant. Archaeology suggests that names related to Yahweh show up in the Iron Age in personal names and inscriptions in some contexts. And the evidence we do have points to Yahweh, worship being well established by the time many biblical texts reach their later forms. That's the mainstream anchor. Yahweh becomes central in Israel's tradition, and this centrality is historically consequential. Now the interpretation angle handled with soft gloves. One interpretation is that traditions associated with El the High, God figure in older Canaanite religion, may have merged or blended with Yahweh traditions as Israelite identity solidified. This is debated, and it's not a single proven pipeline, but it's a plausible way scholars think about the evolution of divine identity in the region. Titles can be transferred, attributes can be reassigned. A god can acquire the resume of another god in the way an institution absorbs another institution. The old signage comes down slowly, but the offices keep running. Historians still argue whether Yahweh originally was understood as a distinct deity alongside El and other gods, later becoming identified with El, or whether El in Israelite usage is primarily a title meaning God that was applied to Yahweh from the start in some communities. That's the heart of the debate. Is it merger? Is it title? Is it both, depending on time and place? There's no full consensus, and you can feel why. We're dealing with layered texts, shifting languages, and the messy reality of lived religion. You pass a cluster of homes built close together, the kind of settlement where everyone knows everyone's business, and also pretends they don't. Ancient privacy is basically a myth, which is ironic because we're talking about myths. In a doorway, you see an old man carving a small sign into wood. It might be a tool handle. It might be a household mark. It might even be devotional. In the ancient world, religion is not always separated from the daily. It's in names, oaths, blessings and curses. It's in the way people greet each other. It's in the way they panic during storms and then pretend they didn't. Archaeology suggests that personal names are one of the small but meaningful clues to religious devotion. If you name your child something like X is my help with a divine element, you are making a quiet declaration about who you trust. This is suggestive, not conclusive for every person, but it's a pattern scholars use carefully, and it's also extremely relatable. You might not name your kid Yahweh is my therapist, but you do name them with meaning, even if the meaning is just, I heard it on a TV show and it sounded cool. Now the cinematic what if slips in like a breeze through reeds. What if you're sitting in a small room lit by a single oil lamp and someone recites an older blessing that uses a title like El Most High, and someone else quietly begins to say that title while thinking specifically of Yahweh, not as a political move, not as a conspiracy, just as a devotional habit. Words drift. Meanings settle. Over time, the title becomes welded to the name in the way two metals fuse under heat. The seam is there, but you can't easily pry it apart. To keep our language safe, let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and different scholars weigh the evidence differently. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Now the quirky or fringe tidbit clearly labelled as such. A popular rumour claims that the divine name, Yahweh, was originally a coded term, a secret that insiders guarded almost like a password that only the initiated could speak. It's a dramatic idea and it fits the modern love for hidden knowledge, but the evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that sacred names often carry taboos and special handling in many cultures, not because they are alien codes, but because names are treated as power. If a name is power, you don't toss it around like confetti. And while we're on names, you notice how the Bible itself later treats the name with seriousness, sometimes emphasizing reverence and restraint. You don't need to treat that as evidence of a secret origin. It might support the idea that reverence grows as a tradition matures and as sacred language becomes part of identity. Historians still argue whether the earliest layers of Israelite religion were functionally monolatrous, worshipping one god while acknowledging others, or monotheistic in a stricter sense from early on, and how those categories even apply to live practice. This debate matters because it keeps you honest. It prevents you from flattening a long process into a single label. You keep walking and you imagine a festival day, a gathering where families bring offerings and share food. The smell of roasted grain and meat mixes with dust and sweat. Children run, dogs lurk hopefully. Someone plays a simple rhythm on a drum, and you can feel how community and devotion reinforce each other. Most historians agree that public ritual binds groups together. Archaeology suggests that feasting and sacrifice are part of ancient Near Eastern religious life in many places. The evidence we do have points to religion as something done, not just thought. One interpretation is that as Yahweh becomes the central figure in Israelite tradition, older regional motifs are reframed. The high god's authority, the storm god's power, the warrior's victory, the judge's role, these can become attributes of Yahweh, not because of a secret theft, but because communities speak in familiar idioms. It's possible that Yahweh's profile grows by absorbing what people already understand as divine greatness. This raises the possibility that the biblical picture of Yahweh as creator, king, and judge is also a reorganization of older categories into one supreme identity. And the what if stays gentle. What if two river paths of tradition merge so smoothly you can't see the seam, and later generations standing on the far bank sincerely believe the river was always one? That isn't a claim of deception. It's a description of how memory works. People inherit stories as wholes. They don't inherit footnotes. You feel your eyes grow heavier, not because the topic is dull, but because the cadence is steady. The hills keep rolling. The lamp smoke keeps curling. The stone keeps cooling. You're not being asked to pick a single hidden truth tonight. You're being asked to watch how names and titles can converge, how devotion can narrow, and how a God once spoken among many can become spoken as the one. The hills keep rolling under your feet like a slow breath, and the lamp, smoke from village doorways, fades into something drier and sharper. The air tastes less like grain and more like stone. You feel the world thinning out as you move south and east in your imagination, away from crowded fields and toward the kinds of places where the horizon is mostly sky and the land looks like it's been patiently scraped down to its essentials. Most historians agree that the southern Levant and the deserts beyond it are not empty backwaters in antiquity, and archaeology suggests that travel routes through these regions matter for trade, herding, mining, and political influence. The evidence we do have points to movement, caravans, seasonal migrations, people carrying goods and stories the way you carry dust on your sandals. This is your mainstream anchor tonight. The desert is not a blank page, it is a corridor. You follow one of those corridors, now a faint path through stony ground, where the wind has a steady voice. Somewhere nearby there might be copper mining areas, small forts or temporary camps, depending on the era you're imagining. You don't need a perfect map for the feeling to land. Out here, survival is practical. Water is sacred. Shade is a luxury. And if you're thinking, wow, this is beautiful, your very next thought is, wow, where is the nearest well? Because ancient life remains extremely committed to reminding you that hydration is not optional. Now we step into the key question this section promises with gentle caution. One interpretation is that devotion to Yahweh may have early connections to the south, to regions associated in later traditions with places like Sinai, Midian, Edom, or the wider desert fringe. This idea shows up in scholarly discussions because some biblical poetry and traditions place Yahweh's coming or presence in southern landscapes, and because the geography of early Israel's formation sits near a web of desert-facing contacts. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the evidence is uneven. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Historians still argue whether Yahweh worship originated primarily within the hill country communities of Canaan and later picked up southern imagery, or whether a southern cultic origin played a significant role and later became woven into Israel's identity narratives. That argument is exactly where we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that southern roots and contacts are historically real. The mist is how directly those contacts connect to the earliest stages of Yahweh devotion. You pause beside an imagined campsite where stones ring a small fire. The flames are modest because fuel is precious, but the heat is enough to make the night feel less enormous. You can hear the subtle crackle of twigs and the same old human sounds, murmurs a cough, a child turning over in sleep, someone trying to make a donkey cooperate with absolutely zero success. Donkeys, it seems, are born with the spirit of a union organizer. Archaeology suggests that these regions see a mix of settled and semi-nomadic lifeways across long periods, and what's broadly accepted is that cultural boundaries here are porous. People exchange goods and ideas along routes the way wind exchanges sand between dunes. A careful reading might suggest that if a deity is associated with wilderness, storm mountain, or journey, that deity's imagery can spread along the pathways where people actually travel. Now a small scholarly clue that sometimes comes up in discussions delivered carefully. Some scholars propose that certain ancient Egyptian references to groups in the southern Levant may include a place name or designation that resembles a form like Yahweh, which some interpret as suggestive of an early Yahweh-related name in a southern context. This is debated and it is not conclusive. It might support the idea that the name or something like it circulated near desert routes earlier than some people expect, or it could reflect something else entirely. The evidence is thin enough that you should hold it like a delicate shard, not a trophy. Here's your mainstream historical fact, woven into the ground beneath your feet: empires like Egypt and later regional powers have interests in these corridors because resources and control matter. That's broadly accepted. Even if you never read a single inscription, you can infer it from geography alone. Roads are power, wells are power, copper is power, and power is basically the ancient version of don't forget to update the group chat. Now the quirky or fringe tidbit clearly labelled. A popular rumour claims that the true location of Mount Sinai has been definitively identified, far from the traditional candidates sometimes placed in modern Saudi Arabia, sometimes tied to dramatic claims like scorched peaks or volcanic evidence. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it circulates because it offers a satisfying feeling of certainty and discovery. A more cautious explanation could be that identifying ancient sacred landscapes is genuinely difficult. Traditions move names, shift routes, change, and the archaeology is not always decisive. So if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And still, you let the cinematic what if drift in like smoke that doesn't choke. What if Sinai is not only a pinpoint on a map, but also a memory map a sacred way of naming the wilderness experience itself? What if the mountain in the story is doing double duty, both as a location and as a symbol of threshold, the place where identity is forged by scarcity, silence, and the feeling of being watched by a sky that never blinks? You stand now in your imagination at the base of a mountain silhouette. The rock face is dark against a star-choked sky. The wind sounds like it's carrying messages, but refuses to deliver them in plain English. You can smell cold stone and faint ash. In this scene, you don't need thunder or special effects. The quiet is powerful enough. You feel how a tradition might place divine encounter here, because wilderness strips life down to essentials. In a palace, you can pretend you are in control. In a desert, you cannot. Your water skin tells the truth. One interpretation is that the southern origin idea, whether literal or symbolic, helps explain why Yahweh is often portrayed with movement approach and presence in untamed places in some traditions. It's possible that devotion begins or is remembered as beginning where human structures are minimal. That doesn't prove a single historical event happened exactly as later texts describe. It suggests a cultural memory that values the wilderness as a place where the divine feels unmediated. And you can sense why that memory sticks. In a crowded pantheon world, a god tied to a specific city can feel like local bureaucracy. Take a number, wait your turn, please fill out the offering form in triplicate. But a god tied to the open, harsh places can feel startlingly personal, like the sky itself has your name on it, which is flattering until you realise the sky may also have your overdue responsibilities on it. Now you keep the solid ground visible again. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Israel's traditions develop over time and incorporate multiple layers of geography and memory. Archaeology suggests complex interactions across the Levant and its desert fringes. The evidence we do have points to contact, movement, and evolving identity. The interpretation is that Yahweh's origins or early profile may connect in some way to southern landscapes, whether through cultic beginnings, poetic imagery, or later theological storytelling. And the imagined gentle layer is this you at the mountain feeling the name take on weight, not because we're proving anything, but because the story knows what wilderness does to a human heart. The wind brushes over the stones, the fire lowers to embers, and you hold your smooth pocket stone one more time, letting it remind you that certainty is rare, but meaning can still be real. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, the path keeps going and the name keeps travelling with it. The wind off the mountain eases and your little campsite dissolves behind you like a dream that leaves ash on your sleeves. You keep moving, not in a hurry, just in that steady, sleepy way your mind drifts when it knows the path matters more than the destination. The smooth stone in your pocket taps gently against your thigh with each step, and the smell of embers follows you for a while before it fades into the dry scent of brush and dust. Most historians agree that early Israelite religious life is not instantly centralized or uniform, and archaeology suggests a mix of household practices, local shrines, and larger cultic centres across the region over long periods. The evidence we do have points to a religion lived at multiple scales. In other words, the sacred doesn't always show up as a grand building with an official schedule. Sometimes it shows up as a corner of a room, a stone set upright, a small bowl for offerings, a whispered blessing before sleep. You pass through a village in the hill country, now the kind of place where homes cluster like stones in a dry creek bed. The walls are rough, the doorways are low, and the floor is packed earth. Inside, the air holds the smell of smoke from last night's cooking fire mixed with the faint sweetness of stored grain. You can hear a goat complaining about something deeply personal. You can also hear a baby doing the ancient performance art piece called I Will Not Let Anyone Rest. This is the real soundtrack of history. In one home, you notice a small niche or shelf, nothing fancy, just a deliberate space where something important belongs. Maybe it's a little figurine, maybe it's a bowl, maybe it's a stone, maybe it's simply empty right now, waiting. Archaeology suggests that household religion in the ancient Levant can include figurines, small altars offering stands or other objects that don't always fit neatly into later theological ideals. The evidence we do have points to practices that are intimate and practical. Protection, fertility, healing, gratitude, fear, hope. These are not abstract philosophical debates. These are the needs of people who wake up to the same hard questions every day. One interpretation is that this household layer of devotion shapes the emotional foundation of later theology, not because it dictates doctrine, but because it trains the heart. If you grow up watching your family bless bread, light a lamp, and speak a divine name with reverence, that name becomes more than an idea. It becomes a texture in your life, like the smell of smoke in your hair or the feel of a smooth stone in your hand. You step outside and follow a path to the edge of the village where a few stones stand in a rough line. There's an altar-like platform nearby, worn and simple. Nothing about it screams monumental. It's the opposite of a tourist attraction, and yet you can feel how it would matter. You can imagine a family bringing a small offering, a little bit of oil, a portion of grain, a whispered plea for rain at the right time, for a child's fever to break, for a journey to end safely. The mainstream safe anchor stays steady here. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Near Eastern religious practice often involves offerings and rituals at both local and household levels. Now you keep the mist gentle and honest. Historians still argue whether these local and household practices should be seen as evidence of early Israelite polytheism in a strict sense, or as a more fluid landscape where devotion to Yahweh could exist alongside other revered figures, symbols, or protective practices that weren't always understood as other gods, in the same way later texts describe. The debate matters because it protects you from cartoon versions of the past. People don't wake up and announce, "Good morning, I will now be an organized monotheist." They wake up and say, "Is there enough flour? And why is the child coughing? And please, God, let the roof hold." You rub your pocket stone again and you think about how stones behave in religion. They last. They don't rot. They don't burn easily. They sit through generations like quiet witnesses. In many ancient contexts, standing stones can mark agreements, memorials, or sacred presence. Archaeology suggests that stones and altars show up across the region in different forms, and the evidence we do have points to their role as durable focal points for ritual. One interpretation is that a stone is a perfect object for a people who travel, settle, move again, and keep telling stories. A stone doesn't need translation. A stone doesn't care who is in charge this year. A stone simply is. You also notice something else, the way sacred space can be ordinary space with a boundary drawn in the mind. A corner becomes holy because someone treats it that way. A threshold becomes meaningful because someone blesses it. A lamp becomes ritual because someone lights it with intention. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it might support the idea that religious identity is trained by repetition more than by argument. You don't become devoted by winning a debate in the comments. You become devoted by doing the same small, meaningful actions until they feel like home. And now the quirky or fringe tidbit, carefully labelled so it stays monetization safe and intellectually honest. A popular rumour claims that archaeologists have found definitive, universally accepted proof of secret forbidden household idols in early Israelite homes that would overturn everything in one clean sweep. This theory isn't widely accepted, mostly because real archaeology is rarely that dramatic and rarely that tidy. A more cautious explanation could be that the material record shows a range of objects and practices, and scholars debate how to interpret them. Some figurines may be religious, some may be decorative, some may be protective symbols, some may be toys. Humans are talented at assigning meaning, and the past doesn't always come with labels. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence for any single object's meaning is often thin. That's why archaeology is both thrilling and humbling. You might find a small figure and want it to shout its purpose at you. It won't. It will sit there silently, forcing you to become a careful listener. You walk again and the village recedes behind you. The night is gentle. The stars are steady. Somewhere far off, a dog barks at the moon like it's filing a formal complaint. You keep returning to the smell motif: smoke. Smoke from cooking, fires from lamps, from offerings. Smoke is the bridge between visible and invisible. It rises without needing permission. It curls into the dark like a question that doesn't demand an answer. One interpretation is that as devotion to Yahweh becomes more exclusive, in some communities, household practices begin to be reinterpreted, regulated, or criticized by voices pushing for purity and focus. That doesn't mean everyone changes at the same time. It's possible that many households keep doing what they have always done, while public religious leaders argue about what should be done. This raises the possibility that later texts condemning certain practices reflect real tension, not a perfectly unified society. People are complicated. Communities are complicated. And if you've ever tried to get a group of adults to agree on where to eat dinner, you already understand ancient religious reform on a spiritual level. Now the cinematic what-if mood note arrives soft as dust settling. What if the most important turning point is not a thunderous announcement, but a small shift in a household routine? What if a family that once spoke many divine titles begins slowly to speak one name more often? Not because they've read a manifesto, but because the name feels like shelter. What if a child falls asleep hearing that name whispered over bread and water, and grows up believing it has always been the centre? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. But even as imagination, it helps you feel how religion becomes personal. It's not just carved into stone, it's carried in habits. You reach down and pick up a small stone from the path, rolling it between your fingers. It's smooth on one side, rough on the other, like history itself. You put it back down, and for a moment you imagine all the hands that have done the same, all the feet that have passed, all the prayers that have risen with smoke into the open air. The temple world will matter soon enough, but tonight you stay with the quieter truth. Before any grand theology can hold a people together, there are homes, altars, stones, and the small daily choice to treat a name as sacred. The village lights fade behind you, and the path widens into something that feels more travelled, more official. The air changes again. You still catch hints of smoke, but now it's mixed with the metallic tang of tools and the earthy smell of stone dust. Somewhere ahead you can almost hear hammering, not frantic, just steady, the kind of sound that says, "We're building something meant to last," which is always adorable because time hears that and smirks. Most historians agree that Israelite and Judean monarchies emerge in the Iron Age, and archaeology suggests increasing complexity in administration, fortifications, and urban centres over time. The evidence we do have points to centralisation processes, more taxes, more record keeping, more bureaucracy, and more arguments about who gets to be in charge of the sacred. In other words, the holy starts to get paperwork. You enter a larger town, then a city, and you can feel the social gravity. Markets are louder. Guards look bored. Officials look busy. People look like they've memorized the art of pretending not to listen while listening to everything. You smell animals, fresh bread, sweat, and that particular scent of a place where too many lives are stacked close together. The sacred in a city feels different. It has walls, it has gates, it has rules. This is your mainstream anchor. Most historians agree that Jerusalem becomes a key political and religious centre in Judah, especially associated in biblical tradition with the temple and royal authority. Archaeology suggests that centralised worship and royal ideology become intertwined in many ancient Near Eastern societies, not just here. The evidence we do have points to a common pattern. Kings build temples, temples legitimize kings, and both of them expect you to show up with offerings and good manners. Now carefully into interpretation. One interpretation is that centralization is not only political but theological. When worship is concentrated in one place, the idea of one God with one house can become more emotionally persuasive. The geography of devotion begins to mirror the theology of devotion. One altar becomes a symbol of one ultimate authority. This is suggestive, Not conclusive, but it might support the idea that architecture can teach theology without a single sermon being spoken. You approach the temple precinct in your imagination. You don't need to picture it in perfect detail. Just feel the shift, the sound of footsteps on stone, the echo of voices, the smell of offerings, the presence of priests, moving with practiced rhythm. You notice how different it is from the household niche with a little lamp. Here everything is scaled up. The sacred has a schedule. The sacred has uniforms. The sacred has a budget. And you also notice the politics humming under the ritual. Kings don't centralize worship just because they enjoy long walks to Jerusalem. Centralization can unify a people, control resources, regulate festivals, and shape identity. A more cautious explanation could be that multiple motives are at work: genuine devotion, statecraft, economic organization, and the human desire to make the world feel ordered by putting everything important in one place. Historians still argue whether the push toward Jerusalem-centered worship reflects primarily a bottom-up religious evolution or a top-down royal project, and how much resistance or variation persisted outside the capital. There's no full consensus, partly because the texts often reflect later ideals and the archaeology reflects lived complexity. The truth is probably messier than either side wants. That's almost always the case. Humans love clean stories. Reality loves complicated ones. Now your quirky or fringe tidbit arrives gently with a clear label. A popular rumour claims that the Jerusalem temple was built using secret ancient technologies, sometimes tied by fringe theorists to Mesopotamian sky beings motifs, as if priests were quietly running a sci-fi lab under the altar. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that monumental building techniques in the ancient Near East are impressive without being supernatural skilled labour-organised resources, and a lot of people doing back-breaking work while someone in charge says, "Great effort, team," and then takes credit. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour itself tells you something about human psychology. People are drawn to the idea that sacred centres hide deeper secrets. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and the temple is the perfect stage for that kind of imagination. You stand near the edge of the court and watch offerings being brought. The smoke rises again, your old motif returning like a lullaby. Smoke from fat and grain, from incense from burning wood. It curls upward like it's climbing invisible stairs. You hear prayers murmured in ordinary voices. You see faces set with hope and worry. Most historians agree that sacrificial systems in the ancient Near East are both religious and social. They redistribute food, reinforce hierarchy, and create shared rhythms. Archaeology suggests that ritual feasting and offerings are widespread in the region. The evidence we do have points to the temple as both spiritual and economic centre. One interpretation is that the temple's prominence helps reshape Yahweh's image from a deity among many possible loyalties into the singular patron of the nation's identity. Yahweh becomes not only my household protector, but our national king. Titles pile up: creator, judge, warrior, enthroned. This raises the possibility that theology becomes more universal as the institution becomes more central. A god of a people starts to sound like a god of everything. And here comes the cinematic what if mood note softly without forcing belief. What if the sound of your footsteps on temple stone becomes the sound of an idea hardening? What if the building itself teaches the worshipper wordlessly, this is the centre, this is the one? You can imagine a pilgrim arriving from a rural village, eyes wide, feeling small, and thinking, if our God has a house like this, maybe our God is bigger than we dare to say out loud. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You also notice tension at the edges. Not everyone lives close to Jerusalem. Not everyone can travel easily. Not everyone wants to give up local shrines and family traditions. And that sets up a natural friction. Even if the official message says one place, the lived reality says many places. Even if the ideal says one way, the daily life says many habits. That's why reforms and prophetic critiques emerge later as recurring themes. The need to unify and the reality of diversity keep bumping into each other like two goats on a narrow path. You smile faintly at the thought, because goats bumping heads is basically the most accurate metaphor for human history. Everyone's sure they're right. Everyone's convinced the other one started it. And nobody remembers why they're arguing after 10 minutes, but they keep doing it anyway. As you leave the temple precinct, in your imagination, the city noise swells again, then softens. The smoke scent clings. The smooth stone in your pocket feels heavier, not physically, but symbolically. You've watched devotion scale up from household corners to national architecture, and you can feel how this shift sets the stage for stronger claims about who Yahweh is, how Yahweh should be worshipped, and why that worship matters for identity and survival. The city stays with you for a while, even as you drift away from its loud markets and stone streets. You can still hear the echo of footsteps in temple courtyards, the low murmur of prayers, the steady hiss of incense meeting flame. The smoke motif refuses to leave, curling through your thoughts like it's trying to underline a point without using bold text. And your smooth stone, that quiet little anchor, bumps gently against your leg with every step like it's keeping time. Most historians agree that periods of reform and religious consolidation appear in the history of Judah and Israel, and archaeology suggests shifting political pressures that could make centralization feel urgent. The evidence we do have points to a world where leaders worry about alliances, borders, and loyalty, and where religion becomes one of the strongest tools for shaping a people's sense of us. If you want unity, you don't just build walls, you build stories. You move through a scene that feels like a public square. Someone is speaking, not softly, not politely, but with the kind of intensity that makes onlookers pause mid-chew. A prophet figure, or a reforming preacher, or a royal messenger channeling that voice. The words are sharp, but the goal is often restorative. turn back focus, stop chasing what doesn't hold. Most historians agree that prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible reflects real social critique and theological debate, even if we can't reconstruct every historical setting with complete clarity. The evidence we do have points to voices that challenge kings, priests, and people alike, which is basically the ancient version of posting an unpopular opinion where everyone can see your name. Now, carefully, the interpretation angle. One interpretation is that reform movements, especially those associated in biblical tradition with certain kings, aim to tighten devotion around Yahweh alone, discouraging or suppressing other cultic practices. This is not a claim that every detail is documented the way a modern reporter would document it. It is a way of reading how the text remembers the struggle for exclusive worship, and it fits broader patterns where central authorities try to standardize religious practice. Historians still argue whether major reforms described in the biblical narratives reflect a single decisive historical program, a series of gradual changes, later ideological storytelling, or some combination of all three. There's no full consensus. That's the honest truth. But what's broadly accepted is that debates over proper worship, proper places and proper loyalty are real features of the tradition, and they likely reflect tensions that existed in some form. You walk down a road lined with small local shrines. Some used, some abandoned, some freshly cleaned because someone still trusts that familiar stone more than a distant temple bureaucracy. You can feel the push and pull. The local sacred is intimate and accessible. The centralized sacred is powerful and official. And when reformers speak, they often speak against the local, not because it lacks meaning, but because it competes with the idea of one center. Archaeology suggests that high places and local cultic sites existed in various forms across the region, and the evidence we do have points to varied religious practice over time. This is your mainstream anchor-lived religion is complex, and standardization is a struggle. Now, the quirky or fringe tidbit clearly framed as such. A popular rumour claims that the prophetic critiques in reform stories are actually coded references to battles against ancient astronaut cults, with Yahweh positioned as the true cosmic commander correcting humanity's allegiance. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that the language of the texts reflects the real religious diversity of the ancient Near East, and the internal struggle to define identity, not a sci-fi conflict. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour still reveals something interesting. Modern readers often translate ancient spiritual conflict into the vocabulary of modern mystery. It's our habit. We put new costumes on old questions. And you remember, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You come to the edge of a town where a reforming official, real or imagined, is tearing down a small shrine. There's no gore, no drama, just the slow, uncomfortable feeling of someone's familiar sacred space being declared invalid. You can almost hear a grandmother muttering, "Well, that's nice," in the tone that means the opposite. You can also hear a young person whispering, "Maybe they're right, because reform can feel like loss and like relief at the same time. One interpretation is that these reforms are driven partly by a theological push toward exclusivity and partly by political needs to unify the kingdom, to resist foreign influence, to consolidate power. A more cautious explanation could be that the motives vary by actor. Some are sincere, some are strategic, some are both. This raises the possibility that religious reform is not a single phenomenon, but a bundle of overlapping efforts. You keep walking and the air shifts again. You smell dust, smoke, and something like crushed herbs. The sound of a flute drifts from a doorway. You think about the everyday person in this world who is not a king, not a prophet, not a priest, just someone trying to keep a roof from leaking and a child from starving. For them, theology isn't a debate club. It's a question, who will help me? When reforms happen, they land in kitchens and courtyards, not just in temples and palaces. Historians still argue whether the strongest push toward exclusive Yahweh worship should be understood as a turning point toward monotheism, or as a tightening form of monolatry that becomes more strictly monotheistic later, especially as theological reflection deepens. Again, the categories are modern tools. Ancient people didn't carry them round like labels on jars, but the trajectory toward exclusivity is a real theme and it matters. Now the cinematic what-if mood note arrives like a soft gust carrying a faint echo of the prophet's voice. What if the most dramatic line in a sermon isn't meant as a historical timestamp, but as a psychological one? What if it marks the moment a community starts to believe that loyalty must be singular, that devotion cannot be divided? What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a secret handoff from Anunnaki myths, but the slow emotional decision to make the divine into one ultimate anchor in a world that keeps shifting. You let the smoke motif return again because it's honest. Offerings rise, altars burn, ideas harden. Reformers cut down what they see as rivals. And through it all, people keep breathing, working, loving, fearing, hoping. The sacred is not only in official proclamations, it's in the way a person whispers a name when they're alone. You step out of the town and onto a quieter path. The night feels thicker, softer. The stars look steady again. Your smooth stone is cool in your palm. The reforms, whether abrupt or gradual, have begun to tighten the story around Yahweh, pushing devotion toward exclusivity, shaping identity through a mix of conviction and necessity. And you can feel the next pressure building in the distance like thunder. You can't yet hear, but somehow already sense. The path grows quieter as you walk, and the air feels heavier in a way you can't quite blame on weather. You still smell smoke, but now it's more like cold ash than warm offering, like the memory of a fire after everyone has gone to bed. The city is behind you, the reforms are behind you, and yet the tension they carried has not dissolved. It lingers in your chest, the way an unfinished argument lingers after the door closes. Most historians agree that the late 8th to 6th centuries BCE are marked by major imperial pressures in the region, and archaeology suggests that Assyrian and Babylonian power reshapes the lives of Israelite and Judean communities through conquest, administration, displacement, and cultural exchange. The evidence we do have points to a turning point: the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the early 6th century BCE, and the deportation of portions of the population to Babylonia. This is solid ground. You can feel how history becomes personal here, because losing a sacred centre is not just political loss, it's identity loss. It's the kind of loss that makes you stare at a wall and think quietly, so what now? You stand in your imagination near a ruined gate, not with cinematic chaos, just with the dull silence that follows catastrophe. No graphic details, no sensationalism, just absence. The smell is dust and stone and cold smoke. The temple, once the loud heart of worship, is now a gap in the city's rhythm, and you can feel something shift inside you, because if your God's house is gone, you have to decide whether your God is also gone, or whether the house was never the point. What's broadly accepted is that exile becomes a crucial context for theological reflection in the Judean tradition. Not the only context, not a single moment of invention, but a pressure chamber where questions get sharpened. The evidence we do have points to communities carrying their identity without the familiar structures, and that forces creativity. If you can't go to the temple, you gather somewhere else. If you can't offer sacrifices, you offer words. If you can't claim the land as the proof of blessing, you have to rethink what blessing means. This is where you can feel religion becoming portable in a new way. You walk beside a river now, but it isn't the Jordan. It's wider, slower, and it tastes like empire. You hear unfamiliar languages, see unfamiliar clothing, smell unfamiliar cooking. The water carries reeds and reflections, and the sky feels the same, which is both comforting and annoying. Comforting because the stars don't change. Annoying because you would really like the universe to at least acknowledge you're having a rough week. The universe, as always, remains emotionally unavailable. Most historians agree that not everyone is deported, and not everyone experiences exile the same way, and archaeology suggests a complex reality of population shifts. Those who remain, those who leave, those who return later, and those who build new lives elsewhere. The evidence we do have points to diversity, not a single uniform experience. And that matters because it keeps you from picturing exile as one monolithic scene. It is many scenes, many families, many strategies for survival. Historians still argue whether the scale and social makeup of the exile were as extensive as some traditional readings suggest, and how much of the later theological development should be attributed directly to exile conditions versus longer-term trends already underway. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. The ancient world is not a spreadsheet with perfect rows. It's more like a jar of mixed pottery shards, and you're trying to reconstruct the bowl while someone keeps coughing dust onto the table. Now into the interpretation angle gently signposted. One interpretation is that the exile accelerates the push toward exclusive devotion and a more universal sense of Yahweh's authority. If Yahweh is only a local deity, then exile is a disaster that makes no sense. But if Yahweh is sovereign beyond borders, then exile can be framed as discipline, as mystery, as a chapter, rather than an ending. This is a theological move, and it's powerful. It's possible that it helps explain why later texts emphasize Yahweh not merely as a national patron, but as the God of all creation. Again, suggestive, not conclusive in every detail, but it fits the psychological need for meaning when structures collapse. You imagine a gathering in a modest courtyard in a foreign city. No temple, no grand altar, just people sitting close, listening. Someone recites traditions. Someone repeats laws. Someone tells the stories again, but with a new ache in the voice. The lamp smoke rises and your old motif returns, because even in exile, smoke still wants to climb. Archaeology suggests that written traditions and communal practices become increasingly significant over time, and what's broadly accepted is that text teaching and identity markers like Sabbath observance, dietary habits, and communal memory can become more central when a people is displaced. The evidence we do have points to a deepening relationship with words. When you can't rebuild the temple immediately, you rebuild the story. And here comes one light joke, because you're still a human trying to cope. You picture someone in exile saying, "All right, we're going to preserve our identity with careful law and tradition," and another person whispering, "Yes, and also maybe we could preserve it with snacks." Because hunger makes theologians out of everyone, but it also makes you extremely focused on bread. Now the quirky or fringe tidbit clearly framed. A popular rumour claims that exiled scribes hid secret true histories, encoded passages sometimes said to contain messages about ancient sky beings or Anunnaki-like figures guiding events behind the scenes. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient writers used symbolism, poetry, and layered narrative for many reasons: theology, politics, pedagogy, art. It's possible to read patterns into texts, but that doesn't mean the patterns are intentional codes. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour still shows how exile invites mystery. When life stops making sense, people look for hidden meaning, like you look for your keys at 2 a.m, convinced the universe is personally hiding them. Spoiler, the universe is not hiding them. They're in your hand. This is also historically plausible. You keep walking along the riverbank and you feel the tension between memory and adaptation. The empire around you has its own gods, its own rituals, its own cosmic stories. You hear about divine councils, Star-Lord temple towers, and the grand idea that a king's power mirrors the heavens. Most historians agree that imperial settings bring cultural contact and exchange, and archaeology suggests that Judean communities in Babylon would have encountered rich religious and intellectual traditions. The evidence we do have points to interaction, not isolation. One interpretation is that this contact shapes how some Judean thinkers articulate Yahweh's uniqueness, not by borrowing a new God, but by sharpening the claim: our God is not one among many, not confined to one place, not limited to one empire. This is where you can feel the one God idea gaining philosophical and cosmic breadth. It's possible that some texts emphasize creation, order, and sovereignty in ways that respond to the surrounding world. That doesn't mean they copied Babylonian religion. It means they argued with it, using the language of the region the way you might argue with a neighbour, using the neighbour's own favourite phrases. It's petty, but effective. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And scholars debate the direction and extent of influence. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You pause, and your smooth stone feels heavier again, not physically, but like it's soaked up the weight of displacement. You think about how a name behaves in exile. At home, the name is supported by walls, festivals, priests, and place. In exile, the name has to stand on its own. It has to become a portable centre, something you can whisper over a meal in a foreign land, something you can teach to children who have never seen Jerusalem's streets. You can feel why the name becomes more precious, more carefully handled, more tightly held. And the cinematic what if comes in softly, almost like a lullaby. What if the loss of the temple becomes the moment the idea of Yahweh stops needing a building to feel real? What if in the quiet between waves on a foreign river, you realise the God you're speaking to is not trapped behind any wall? Not because we can prove it in a laboratory, but because the story is trying to keep a people alive. The river moves, the lamp smoke rises, the stars keep their indifferent watch, and you keep walking, carrying the name like a small ember that refuses to go out even when the wind changes. The river's slow surface fades behind you, but you can still feel it in your mind, that steady, indifferent movement that keeps going, no matter what you lost. The ash smell in the air softens into something more like ink papyrus and old leather. You're not in a palace or a temple now. You're in the quieter space where identity gets stitched back together with words. Most historians agree that the Hebrew Bible reflects a long process of composition, compilation and editing. And archaeology suggests that written traditions, scribal activity, and textual transmission play major roles in the ancient Near East. The evidence we do have points to texts that are layered, sometimes preserving older material, sometimes reshaping it for new circumstances. This is a mainstream safe anchor that matters tonight, because it keeps you from imagining the Bible as a single book, dropped from the sky, fully bound and chapter numbered. It's more like a library with fingerprints on every shelf. You step into an imagined room where a scribe sits with a lamp. The light is warm and steady. You smell oil smoke and something faintly sour, like glue or treated hide. The scribe's hands move slowly, carefully, because copying is not just writing, it's preservation, it's devotion. It's also the ancient version of, if I mess this up, my boss will notice. You watch ink pool into letters, and you hear the soft scratch of reed on surface. Archaeology suggests that scribes trained through long practice, and the evidence we do have points to scribal schools and administrative writing across the region, which means the skills needed to preserve sacred traditions aren't invented overnight. They're part of the cultural toolkit. Most historians agree that the biblical texts likely draw on older oral traditions, local archives, royal records, priestly materials, and prophetic collections woven together over time. That's broadly accepted. The exact timeline and details are debated, but the layered character is hard to miss. Now gently into the interpretation angle. One interpretation is that the editorial process is not merely technical, but theological. When communities face crisis and change, they don't just record facts, they arrange meaning. They emphasize certain themes, highlight certain covenants, and frame events in a way that supports identity. This is suggestive, not conclusive about every passage, but it might support the idea that the Bible's God becomes more sharply defined through the act of storytelling itself. The way you tell your history shapes what you think your God is like. Historians still argue whether key parts of the Pentateuch and historical books took their final forms primarily in the exilic period, the post-exilic period, or through multiple stages extending across both, and how much earlier material is embedded within those final forms. There's no full consensus, and that's not a problem, it's a feature. It means the text is alive with multiple voices, like a chorus where some singers are very old and some joined later, and a few are clearly improvising. And yes, you can hear the one guy who thinks he's the soloist. You notice something soothing: the editors do not always smooth away rough edges. Contradictions, doublets, different emphases, multiple perspectives, they remain. That's part of why these texts feel human. A careful reading might suggest that preserving complexity was sometimes intentional, or at least accepted, because life is complex and memory is layered. This raises the possibility that the Bible's development is not a straight line toward one neat idea, but a braided rope of traditions pulled tight under pressure. Now the quirky or fringe tidbit clearly framed. A popular rumour claims that there once existed a single original Bible text, perfectly pure, that later authorities deliberately altered to hide shocking truths about Yahweh's origins, sometimes tied to Anunnaki-style myths or secret divine genealogies. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient texts commonly exist in multiple versions and recensions. Because copying is manual, communities are diverse and theological emphasis shifts. Variation doesn't automatically equal conspiracy. Sometimes it equals tired scribes, regional traditions, and the ancient equivalent of, I swear I copied it exactly, but my lamp went out. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence for a grand, unified cover-up is thin. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You watch the scribe pause, flexing fingers. You can almost see the cramps. Writing is physically demanding. And here comes your light joke for the night. Imagine being the person who has to copy a long law code by hand and still stay spiritually uplifted. That's not divine inspiration, that's divine endurance. Somewhere in the margins of history, a scribe is absolutely thinking, blessed are those who invented the printing press, even though nobody has invented it yet. Most historians agree that as Judean communities rebuild after exile under Persian rule, questions of identity law and worship become central. Archaeology suggests administrative structures and local governance under empires, and the evidence we do have points to communities negotiating their place within larger political systems. In that setting, texts can serve as portable sacred space. They can become the temple you carry, the center you can open anywhere. One interpretation is that this is when the idea of Yahweh as not only national God, but universal creator becomes increasingly emphasized in certain streams of tradition. Again, not invented from nothing but sharpened. It's possible that the trauma of exile and the challenge of living under empires make universal claims feel necessary. If Yahweh is truly sovereign, then Yahweh's reach must extend beyond borders. This might support the idea that theology expands in response to political reality, the way you expand your definition of home when you can't go back to the old one. You also sense the careful balancing act. Texts often insist on distinctiveness, on loyalty, on boundaries. Yet they also exist within a world of shared cultural motifs, divine counsels, cosmic battles, creation, imagery, wisdom, traditions. The Bible doesn't float in a vacuum. It speaks in a regional language of symbols. One interpretation is that biblical writers and editors take that shared language and aim it at a singular center, saying, in effect, we know the vocabulary, but we're using it to make a different claim. Historians still argue whether certain biblical passages preserve echoes of older polytheistic or henotheistic frameworks beneath later monotheistic readings, and how those echoes should be interpreted. Scholars continue to debate whether some phrases are remnants of earlier stages, poetic conventions, or deliberate literary choices. There's no full consensus, and that's why careful language matters. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You lean closer to the lamplit table, and you see a small detail, a correction. A word scratched out, rewritten. A tiny mark that changes the meaning. The human hand is right there, and it's oddly comforting. It reminds you that sacred tradition is not only thunder from the mountain, it is also a person at a desk doing careful work, hoping the ink doesn't smudge. That kind of devotion is quiet, but it changes history. Now the cinematic what if mood note arrives with the softness of turning pages. What if the very act of stitching traditions together becomes a kind of spiritual technology? Not alien technology, not secret devices, but the human power to preserve meaning through narrative. What if the name Yahweh, once tied to place and altar, becomes tied to text and memory so strongly that it can survive any empire? What if the story is pointing at something else, that the God of the Bible is shaped not only by ancient encounters, but by centuries of reflection, argument, editing, and care? You pull back from the table, letting the lamp's smoke curl up into darkness. The smoke motif returns, but it's different now. It's not sacrifice smoke. It's lamp smoke, study smoke. The smoke of long nights spent keeping a tradition alive. Your smooth stone is still in your pocket, cool and steady, and you can feel the next step coming, the way older divine assemblies and crowded pantheons get reframed, not erased as Yahweh's uniqueness grows more absolute in the language of later texts. The lamplit room stays with you as you drift onward, like the afterglow you see when you close your eyes after staring at a candle. ink smell, oil smoke, the gentle scratch of reed on surface. Even the silence has texture. It's the silence of people listening so closely to words that the words start to feel like architecture. Most historians agree that ancient Near Eastern cultures often pictured the divine world as an assembly or council, and archaeology suggests that imagery of thrones, heavenly courts, and layered cosmic order is widespread in the region. The evidence we do have points to this motif showing up in multiple traditions. The idea that divine authority is structured, deliberative, and sometimes dramatized as a court scene. This is your solid ground tonight. The divine council isn't a fringe invention. It's part of the cultural vocabulary. Now you hold that vocabulary up to the later biblical tradition and watch what happens to it. What's broadly accepted is that the Hebrew Bible sometimes uses language that sounds like a council or assembly in the heavens, especially in poetic or visionary contexts. Yet at the same time, the overall trajectory in many texts is toward Yahweh's supreme uniqueness. One interpretation is the older council imagery is not deleted but reframed. The stage remains, but the cast changes. The other gods become angels, messengers, or subordinate beings. The cosmic meeting still happens, but the authority is centralized. Historians still argue whether biblical references that look like council scenes preserve genuine remnants of earlier polytheistic frameworks, or whether they are literary conventions and metaphors adapted to a monotheistic theology. There's no full consensus. Some scholars emphasize continuity with older Near Eastern motifs. Others emphasize how radically the biblical writers reshape those motifs. Both can be true in different ways. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and the debate is part of what makes the topic interesting without being misleading. You imagine a courtroom not with marble and microphones, but with symbolic grandeur, thrones, radiance, an atmosphere that feels like wind made visible. The imagery is big because the questions are big. Who governs the world? Who judges? Who decides? And you realize with a sleepy smile that humans seem unable to imagine ultimate authority without imagining a meeting about it. Somewhere in the universe, the divine is apparently hosting a committee, which is hilarious because committees are where decisions go to take a nap. Archaeology suggests that in many ancient cultures, the king's court mirrors the god's court, and the evidence we do have points to a relationship between political structures and cosmic imagination. One interpretation is that as Israelite and Judean theology emphasizes Yahweh's kingship, the language of court and council becomes a way to communicate that kingship using familiar terms. It's possible that the writers say in effect, yes, we know the cosmic courtroom imagery, but here is our claim. Yahweh is not simply one voice in the room. Yahweh is the authority the room exists to serve. Now the quirky or fringe tidbit clearly framed. A popular rumour claims that angels in biblical texts were originally misremembered descriptions of Anunnaki-like beings, and that later editors rebranded them to fit a new religious system. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that messenger beings and intermediary figures are common in ancient religions, and the way they are described reflects literary genre, theological emphasis, and the need to express transcendence in relatable terms. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour still points to something real. People sense a transformation in the spiritual cast of characters, and they look for a single dramatic cause. History rarely gives you that convenience. You keep the solid ground visible again. What's broadly accepted is that as monotheistic claims strengthen divine beings other than Yahweh are increasingly placed into subordinate categories, whether as angels, messengers, or personified forces. Archaeology suggests that this kind of reclassification happens in many religious traditions as they evolve. The evidence we do have points to continuity in imagery paired with change in interpretation. The old language survives, but it's redirected. Historians still argue whether certain passages that mention sons of God or similar phrases should be read as reflecting an older divine family model, as poetic symbolism, or as later theology preserving archaic language for effect. Scholars continue to debate how to map these phrases onto historical religious development without oversimplifying. There's no full consensus, and that's why your truth ladder remains in your pocket, stone solid ground, then mist, then gentle imagination. You step out of the scribal room and into a night sky again, because your mind keeps toggling between text and cosmos. The stars look the same as they did in Mesopotamia, which is both poetic and mildly inconvenient for anyone who wants a clean break between cultures. The heavens are a shared ceiling. People across the region stare up and ask similar questions. What changes is how they answer. One interpretation is that Israel's later theology takes the shared cosmic stage and insists on a unique central actor. The story becomes less about a pantheon's politics and more about one sovereign will. This raises the possibility that the council imagery becomes a narrative device rather than a theological commitment to multiple gods. In other words, the language remains because it's effective, but the underlying claim shifts. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Different scholars pass the evidence differently, and genre matters. Poetry speaks differently than law. Vision speaks differently than chronicle. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now the cinematic what-if mood note arrives soft as a page turning. What if the divine council is the last shadow of an older world, still visible at the edges of the text like an earlier sketch beneath the painting? What if you can sense the older lines without claiming they are the final picture? What if the story is pointing at something else that the Bible preserves traces of its own becoming, and those traces are not mistakes, but clues? You walk through the night and think about how people handle spiritual complexity. Sometimes they simplify it, sometimes they reorganize it, sometimes they rename it. A council becomes a court, gods become angels. Rival powers become metaphors. The process can feel like erasure, but it can also feel like refinement. One interpretation is that the move toward one God is as much about clarity as it is about power. In a world of competing voices, a single voice can feel like rest. And yes, you make one last light joke to keep the tone sleepy and human. Imagine being an angel in this reorganized cosmic system and finding out your new job title is messenger, and your benefits include occasional flaming sword. That's not a career ladder, that's a career hazard. You take a slow breath and you notice the smoke motif again, but now it's barely there. Just the faint memory of lamp smoke, a reminder that these ideas are carried by people sitting in rooms preserving words. And in those preserved words you can feel the divine world narrowing, not into emptiness, but into focus. Yahweh is being portrayed less as one among the powerful and more as the source of power itself. The night sky stays above you like a steady ceiling, and the last faint trace of lamp smoke seems to dissolve into the cold air. You keep walking slow and soft, as if your footsteps are trying not to wake the ancient world. The smooth stone in your pocket is still there, calm and cool, and it's starting to feel like a tiny symbol for the whole project, something ordinary that becomes meaningful because you keep returning to it. Most historians agree that modern Anunnaki to Bible connections are largely a contemporary interpretation rather than a mainstream historical conclusion, and archaeology suggests that cultural borrowing in the ancient Near East is real, but usually traceable through ordinary channels like language trade and shared literary motifs. The evidence we do have points to influence and interaction, yes, but not to a single secret handoff. That's your solid ground for this section. The region is interconnected and stories travel, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we're not swimming in that kind of evidence. Now we step into the mist deliberately because this section is where we address the mystery theories head on, while keeping them gentle and monetization safe. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal beings, and that Yahweh, or the biblical conception of God, is a transformed memory of those beings. Some versions suggest Yahweh was originally one member of a group later elevated. Other versions suggest Yahweh was a title applied to a powerful visitor. A popular rumour claims ancient texts were misread on purpose to hide this. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And it's thin. Let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What's broadly accepted is that the term Anunnaki belongs to Mesopotamian mythic frameworks and changes meaning across time and texts. What's also broadly accepted is that Israelite religion develops within the Levantine cultural environment, which includes Canaanite traditions and the wider Near Eastern world. These two facts can coexist without forcing a literal identity between Anunnaki and Yahweh. Historians still argue whether the best way to describe the relationship between Israelite religion and its neighbours is primarily continuity with transformation, or sharper discontinuity with selective borrowing, and how much each model applies in different periods. There's no full consensus, but scholars continue to debate these questions in terms of texts, archaeology, and cultural context, not in terms of hidden extraterrestrial archives. Now, a careful reading might suggest why the fringe link feels persuasive to some listeners. Here are the hooks the theory often grabs, presented gently as interpretation rather than endorsement. 1. Both traditions contain grand cosmic language. If you already love sky mystery ideas, anything from heaven can sound like from space. 2. Both traditions can include divine councils or assemblies which can be reimagined as groups of beings. 3. Both traditions deal with creation order and human purpose, which can invite the modern urge to treat myths as encoded history. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see the psychological appeal. It turns complexity into a single storyline with a neat twist. But the evidence we do have points to a more cautious explanation. Myths are not lab reports. They are meaning-making narratives. And translation is not mind-reading. Words shift. Genres differ. A poetic image is not the same as a literal claim. Archaeology suggests that when texts are copied across centuries, they are preserved within living traditions that interpret them, not within secret vaults with one true key. Historians still argue whether modern reconstructions that draw straight lines from Mesopotamian myths to biblical theology underestimate the distinctiveness of Israelite tradition, or whether traditional religious readings underestimate the shared cultural backdrop. That's a real fair debate. But it's a debate about cultural development, not about hidden aliens. Now your quirky or fringe tidbits framed clearly. A popular rumour claims that a particular modern author translated Sumerian texts to show that the Anunnaki genetically engineered humans, and that Yahweh is a later disguise of the same story. This isn't widely accepted, and scholars have criticised many such claims as relying on questionable translations and creative leaps. I'm not going to call anyone names tonight, because we're keeping the tone sleepy and PG-13, but the broader point stands. Extraordinary narratives often depend on highly selective readings. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and it's a reminder that modern myths can grow around ancient myths like vines around an old wall. You keep walking and the landscape shifts into a kind of mental library shelves of ideas, some ancient, some modern. You think about how the internet functions like a new oral tradition. Stories spread fast, they mutate, they get simplified, they pick up dramatic details because dramatic details get clicks. This is not a moral panic, just an observation. The modern world does with myths what ancient storytellers did. It adapts them to the needs of the audience. One interpretation is that Anunnaki theories thrive because they offer a third way between strict literalism and skeptical dismissal. They let people keep the feeling of mystery while moving it into a modern frame. It's possible that this gives a sense of wonder without requiring commitment to traditional theology. That's a psychological reading, not a historical proof, but it might support the idea that these theories are less about ancient evidence and more about modern meaning-making. Historians still argue whether the persistence of such theories reflects genuine gaps in scholarly knowledge or mostly reflects the human tendency to prefer unified narratives over messy ones. There's no full consensus even in how to interpret the popularity of these ideas, because cultural psychology is complicated. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the gaps in ancient evidence are exactly where modern imagination likes to build cabins and move in. Now the cinematic what-if mood note arrives calm and not demanding belief. What if the story is pointing at something else entirely? Not that Yahweh is an Anunnaki, but that humans keep reskinning the unknown in the imagery that fits their era. In Mesopotamia, the unknown wears divine robes. In the modern world, the unknown wears a spacesuit. The question stays the same: what is behind the sky silence? The costume changes. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We're keeping the solid ground separate from the mist. And here comes a light joke to tuck in the seriousness. If ancient people had YouTube, you just know someone would have titled a tablet Top 10 Signs Your God is actually from space, and the comments would be full of first and wake up sheeple, and one guy insisting the flood was fake because he personally has never seen a flood. Humanity is consistent. You slow your steps again. The stone in your pocket is steady. You've walked through the theory landscape without pretending it's settled. You've kept the mainstream history and archaeology in view while letting the mystery have its soft cinematic space. And now with the night deepening, you can feel the next shift coming the way later periods expand Yahweh's identity further through new empires, new languages and new titles without needing an Anunnaki shortcut to explain it. The library of ideas fades into the night again, and you find yourself back under the open sky where the air feels cooler and the horizon feels wider. The smooth stone in your pocket is still there, and now it feels less like a prop and more like a companion, the kind you don't talk to but keep anyway. The smoke motif returns too, but faintly, like a memory of lamp oil and temple incense that's been absorbed into your clothing over centuries. Most historians agree that after the Babylonian exile, Judean life is shaped by successive empires, especially the Persian and then the Hellenistic worlds, and archaeology suggests major cultural, administrative and linguistic shifts during these periods. The evidence we do have points to a community negotiating identity under foreign rule, rebuilding, reorganizing and redefining what it means to belong. This is your mainstream anchor for the section. History doesn't stop at exile. It keeps moving, and so does theology. You walk into a world where Aramaic is widely used in administration, where Persian imperial structures set new political rhythms, and where Jerusalem is rebuilt in fits and starts. You can almost hear the sound of new timbers being hauled, stones being reset, arguments being held in public squares with the intensity of people who desperately want stability. Most historians agree that the Second Temple period becomes a time of intensified focus on law, community boundaries, and worship. Archaeology suggests administrative documents, seals and material culture consistent with life under empire, and the evidence we do have points to both continuity and innovation. Then the air shifts again because the Hellenistic world arrives like a new language in your mouth. Greek cities, Greek coinage, Greek philosophy, Greek theatres. Even if you never set foot in a gymnasium, the ideas reach you. The question of identity gets sharper. What's broadly accepted is that this period brings cultural blending and conflict, and the evidence we do have points to intense debates within Judean society about how to live under these influences. Historians still argue whether the most significant drivers of religious change in this era are external pressures from imperial cultures, internal developments already underway, or the push and pull between different Judean groups with competing visions. There's no full consensus, but the overall shape is clear: the world is bigger, and so the language about God becomes bigger too. Now the interpretation angle gently signposted. One interpretation is that as Judeans live within empires that claim universal authority, they increasingly articulate Yahweh's authority in universal terms. If a Persian king claims to rule many peoples, and if Greek thought talks about cosmic order, then it's possible that Judean thinkers respond by emphasizing Yahweh as the true sovereign over all nations and all creation. This is not a claim of simple borrowing, it's a claim of dialogue. Ideas collide and theology responds. You can feel this in the way titles multiply and deepen. Yahweh is not only a national patron, not only a temple deity, but the creator, the ruler of history, the judge of nations. This might support the idea that monotheism gains not just exclusivity but scope. The God of Israel becomes in many texts the God of everything, and the covenant story is framed against a global canvas. Now your quirky or fringe tidbit clearly labelled. A popular rumour claims that during these imperial periods, secret priestly groups preserved an older Yahweh tradition that still remembered the Anunnaki as literal beings, and that this secret tradition fed into later mystical movements. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that mystical traditions and apocalyptic imagery develop for many reasons: political pressure, yearning for justice, symbolic storytelling, and the human need to imagine a hidden order behind visible chaos. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the existence of mystery language in later Jewish texts is not itself fringe. What's broadly accepted is that the Second Temple period includes diverse literature wisdom writings, apocalyptic visions, expanded angelologies, and intense reflections on cosmic order. Archaeology suggests the complexity of this world through manuscripts, sectarian communities, and material evidence of varied practices. The evidence we do have points to diversity, not a single unified voice. One interpretation is that as Yahweh's uniqueness is emphasized, the spiritual ecosystem around that uniqueness gets populated with more intermediary figures: angels, messengers, personified wisdom, heavenly books, cosmic battles described in symbolic terms. This raises the possibility that monotheism doesn't eliminate spiritual imagination, it reorganizes it. It's like cleaning a cluttered room. You don't throw everything away, you put it into drawers and label them. Of course, this is a metaphor, and in real life you might label the drawer miscellaneous and promise yourself you'll organize it later. That too is historically plausible. Historians still argue whether the rise of elaborate angelology and apocalyptic imagery in this era reflects continuity with older Near Eastern mythic patterns, innovation under new pressures, or a creative mix of both. There's no full consensus, but it's reasonable to say the period is a laboratory of religious imagination shaped by empire and expectation. You walk through a marketplace where Greek is spoken alongside local tongues. You see coins stamped with kings' faces, the ancient version of having someone's profile picture forced into your hand every time you buy bread. You hear debates about purity practice and loyalty. You sense a growing hunger for certainty, and you realize certainty is always in high demand when the world feels controlled by outsiders. One interpretation is that this hunger contributes to sharper boundary making, defining who belongs, what practices matter, and how to keep faith distinct. It's possible that this is one reason texts and traditions emphasize exclusive devotion and strict observance. That doesn't mean everyone agrees. Far from it. There are internal debates, competing groups, and differing visions of how to live. The story isn't one voice. It's a crowded room where everyone thinks they're the calm one. Now the cinematic what-if mood note arrives soft as the sound of pages turning in a night library. What if the expansion of Yahweh's identity is like a lens widening? What if the name remains the same, but the horizon behind it grows larger as empires grow larger? What if the story is pointing at something else, not a hidden alien origin, but the way a tradition learns to speak about the divine in a world that keeps changing languages? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You take a slow breath. The smoke motif returns again, barely there, like incense clinging to stone. The smooth pocket stone is cool and steady. You can feel that you're approaching the last stretch, where all these layers settle into the familiar biblical picture many people recognize, and where the bedtime tone begins to soften further, preparing you for a gentle landing. The night feels softer now, as if the air itself has decided to speak in quieter vowels. You keep walking, but your steps slow and the ground beneath you feels less like a road and more like a long exhale. The smooth stone in your pocket is cool and familiar, and the smoke motif is barely a scent now, more like a remembered warmth than an active fire. You've carried clay lamp oil, temple incense, and desert embers through your imagination, and all of it has brought you here to the place where the story settles into what many people recognize as the God of the Bible. Most historians agree that by the late Second Temple period, Jewish tradition presents Yahweh as the one supreme God, creator, judge, and covenant partner, and archaeology suggests a complex religious landscape with diverse communities and texts. The evidence we do have points to a faith that has been shaped by centuries of debate, empire loss, rebuilding, and reflection. That's your solid ground. The biblical picture of God doesn't appear out of nowhere. It arrives through a long path. Now gently the interpretation. One interpretation is that the line from ancient Near Eastern divine language to the mature biblical theology is best understood as transformation rather than substitution. Older motifs, councils, titles, cosmic imagery, they don't vanish. They are re-aimed. The tradition keeps the familiar vocabulary, but insists on a different center. Yahweh alone is ultimate. This is suggestive, not conclusive in every detail, but it might support the idea that religious evolution often looks like editing a song. The melody stays, the harmonies shift, and suddenly the whole thing feels new, even though it's made of old notes. Historians still argue whether the most decisive turning point towards strict monotheism happens earlier, perhaps in the exilic crisis, or later through Second Temple reflection and community boundary making, and how evenly that shift spreads across different groups. There's no full consensus, but the general trajectory is widely accepted. Exclusive devotion strengthens and universal claims erkined. You pause and imagine a gathering at night, not a grand temple ceremony this time, but a community reading, praying, remembering. The lamp is small, the room is simple. The words are heavy with meaning. A child leans against a parent's shoulder, half asleep, hearing the divine name spoken with reverence. And you realize this is the quiet power that survives empires, not the stones of buildings, but the rhythm of words and practices carry from mouth to ear to heart. Now we bring back the mystery theories one last time, not to crown them, but to place them gently on the shelf where they belong. A fringe idea proposes that Yahweh is a transformed memory of Anunnaki-like beings, and that the Bible preserves a hidden cosmic backstory. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And it's thin. The evidence we do have points more strongly to cultural development within the ancient Near Eastern world, shared motifs, contested identities, theological reflection, and the human need to make meaning out of history. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory can function as a modern parable about mystery. It reminds you that people keep sensing the depth beneath the text. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clues taken together suggest a long journey from crowded pantheons to a singular focus, from local shrines to universal sovereignty, from smoke rising at an altar to words rising in prayer. Historians still argue whether certain biblical portrayals of divine anger, warfare language, or cosmic conflict should be read as remnants of older mythic patterns, as historical reflections of real threats, as literary conventions, or as theological rhetoric. There's no full consensus, but you can hold the debate without fear. You don't need a single hidden truth to respect the complexity of the text. And here's your quirky or fringe tidbit, framed clearly and kindly. A popular rumour claims that somewhere there exists a lost ultimate tablet or scroll that will finally connect the Anunnaki directly to Yahweh with a neat, undeniable line. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it's partly a wish, the wish for closure. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient evidence rarely delivers closure. It delivers fragments, and the human mind supplies bridges. Sometimes those bridges are reasonable interpretations. Sometimes they're wild, cinematic guesses. Neither is a crime as long as you label them honestly. You smile to yourself because you can feel how sleepy this all is when it's handled carefully. The truth ladder is comforting, documented ground, interpreted, mist-imagined moonlight. It means you don't have to fight the night. You can let the questions exist without forcing answers. And now, with the story nearly complete, you can look back down the path without previously and without restarting anything. You began in clay and city temples. You passed through Anunnaki myths as mythic scaffolding. You moved into the Levant's shifting identities. You watched Canaanite pantheons and titles reshaped. You felt the name Yahweh sharpen and expand. You stood in deserts and at altars. You watched kings centralize worship. You listened to prophets push for focus. You felt exile crack the old structures and texts rebuild the center. You watched divine councils become angelic hierarchies. You examined modern fringe theories and kept them in the mist. And you walked through the second temple world where the vocabulary of God becomes cosmic and singular. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because this matters. That's a narrative summary, not a proof. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The solid ground is that Yahweh becomes the God of the Bible through a long historical process. The mist is how exactly each step happens and how each motif transforms. The gentle imagination is the way we've walked through it like a dream. Now the pacing begins to slow further, and the vocabulary softens because it's time for the wind down, the part where the lights dim all the way and the story tucks itself into the quiet. Your smooth stone is still in your pocket, and you take it out one last time. You roll it between your fingers. It's cool, simple and real. It doesn't claim to be a key to hidden worlds. It doesn't insist on certainty. It just sits in your hand steady. And you realize that this is what the best history does when you hear it at night. It steadies you. It reminds you that humans have always lived with questions bigger than their roofs, and they have always found ways to carry meaning across time. You imagine the smoke again, but softer now, like incense far away in a stone building you can't quite see. Smoke rises and disappears, and still the scent lingers. That's how stories work. They rise, they fade, and yet something stays with you, something you can't quite measure but can feel. You breathe in slowly and you let the final image settle. A lamp in a quiet room, a page turning, a whispered name spoken with care. Not because we can prove every detail, but because people kept speaking it, kept writing it, kept shaping it, kept arguing about it, kept praying into it, until it became for many the single word at the center of the world. And you can let the questions remain where they belong, like stars you don't need to reach. You don't have to solve the sky to rest beneath it. You don't have to force a neat explanation for every ancient fragment. You can simply let the documented ground hold you, let the interpreted mist drift gently at the edges, and let the imagined moonlight give the story its softness. The night around you is calm, the road is quiet, the stone is cool, the smoke is only a memory, and the name, whatever you make of it, has travelled a very long way through human hands and human hearts, carried not by certainty alone, but by the steady, stubborn need to belong to something larger than fear.